for more than 20 plus years when we started conversing as if we never left. We just connected. Similar with Paul, he had that feeling. Despite 10 years since they last saw each other, despite 800 miles away, the closeness was there. And this letter in Philippians, Paul bears out his feelings. He shows and tells them what's on their mind, what's on his mind, the depth of his love he has for the church. In light of the context of this book, we know that the Philippians knew the situation of Paul. They knew the hardship that Paul was encountering throughout these years. They knew it so well and they felt concerned that they sent money. That's why this letter was written, was because they sent money and Epaphroditus. So the Philippians knew what was happening to Paul. That now he's in jail and he could die, and they wanted to continually show their love. You know, there's several types of prisoners during that time. Depende kung may pera ka o wala. Or if you're privileged enough or not. The best is the house arrest, wherein you live in your house and you're arrested there. The second is you're arrested in jail and they send you food. The third is you're arrested in jail but they don't provide you food. The third is you're arrested and tied to a tree outside with no food. And it is gleaned by what is happening here that for some reason he had no food. That's why the people in Philippi was sending Epaphroditus to be used by him with money. And some commentators were saying so that he can do the grocery and cook the food and provide it to Paul. Now, what's great, despite the Philippians knowing the situation of Paul, Paul was focusing on them. Paul did not want the Philippians to worry. He wants to allay their fears. That's why when he starts the letter, he does not discuss my problems, my trial, my grief. He was focusing on them and how God was using them for the work of God. And I ask myself, I wonder how my Paul would view me. Try to imagine the person who shared the gospel to you. Try to imagine your Paul. What would he say about you today? Because Paul, as we look, we will see how grateful he is, how encouraged he was. Because after 10 years, the Philippians were still faithful. Could that be said of us as we look into our lives? Secondly, ask Paul to people that we shepherd, how are they doing? You know, a lot of times, people think that the moment, especially in D groups or cell groups or growth groups, whatever you call that, gathering, a lot of times that we think that time erases responsibility. If God has entrusted you with certain people to take care and disciple, one day God will take an accounting of that. And we should remember that we should take care. That's why some of the people that I disciple, and if they're really not committed, I really talk to them. I said, you know what? It's better that you go to another group because one day I need to give an account for you. And I rather you be accounted for by another person. But sometimes what happens is if a person is not wanting to be discipled, we just forget about it and we think that time will erase our responsibility. Well, it does not. That's why it's important that we give them to another group or to another person to disciple, so and who knows, maybe it's just your chemistry doesn't work or your style of discipleship doesn't work. So here in verse 3, Philippians chapter 1 verse 3, it says, I thank my God in all my remembrance of you. What Paul is saying here is, when I think about you, the people in Philippi, my heart bursts in thanks. When he says, I thank my God, it was said in the present tense, which means I always thank God. I continually thank God in all my remembrance of you. The literal translation of that is, all my remembrance of you causes me to thank God. What a lovely thing to say. All my remembrance of you causes me to thank God. Can our disciples say that of us? In Galatians, how did Paul address them? You foolish Galatians, who bewitched you? In Corinthians, he says, I thank God that I did not baptize any of you. But here, he says, I thank God in all my remembrance of you. When somebody mentions Philippi, Paul would thank God. It's like saying, I can't get you out of my mind. You're continually in my thoughts. Wherever I go, I see your face. I remember you, all the acts that you've done in the past. Your faithfulness. Everything. Whenever somebody mentions, you know what, I just came from Philippi. I remember you and I remember your faithfulness. And Paul says, I thank God continually because of that. And that is startling because 10 years has passed. How often are you thankful for something that happened 10 years ago? Not as often, right? In fact, if it's that long, probably we're not thankful about it anymore. Here, Paul is showing that he was continually thanking them. This is despite the fact that 10 years has passed, 800 miles apart, and after going from Philippi, Paul went to Berea. After that, he went to Thessalonica. After that, he went to Athens. He went to Corinth. Stayed there for 18 months. Then he went to Ephesus. Then he went to Troas. Then he went to Miletus. Then he went to Caesarea. Went to Jerusalem. Went to Malta. Then to Rome. Paul was all over. He was in every house, every synagogue, every street, every town, every continent. And he says something. Despite all that, I cannot get you out of my mind. What a lovely thing to say. That encounter in Acts was so powerful. Acts does not show the fellowship that they had while he was living in the house of Lydia. But Paul couldn't get them out of this mind, despite all the churches he established after. Despite all the people he has met, no one could replace the church in Philippi in his mind. 10 years after. sometimes if I was Paul, I might have forgotten it. Why? I would say, I was in Philippi, and guess what? I was beaten up to a pulp. Yep. I remember that place. It's a trauma place. Right? I would think that way. Try to imagine being beat up until you passed out and you're in jail. It was not necessarily a great experience. And I realized no church is perfect. And no one is perfect. No one's without fault. Yet, Paul was able to see the workings of God in their life, and he was thankful. How they responded to the gospel, how enthusiastic they were, and how they never forgotten about the ministry. His bad experience was overpowered by the good things that God was doing in their life. Paul was thankful and was unwavering in his things. Paul turned every thought that he had on the church in Philippi to an opportunity to praise God. Remembering them is always connecting and thanking God. He's saying, I can still see your face. The time we laughed, the time we shared, how hungry you were in the Word. Every day when we were, you remember those times when we were going to the river and there was this demon possessed who's now your church, remember? Oh, kumusta ka na? I mean, it was so good. It was so intimate. And the church in Philippi never forgot Paul. Go to Philippians chapter 4. Philippians chapter 4, verse 15 says, You yourself also know, Philippi, that at the first preaching of the gospel, after I left Macedonia, no church shared with me in the matter of giving and receiving, but you alone. In the Greek, the emphasis is in the word no and you alone. No church, not even one. Despite mentioning all those places that he went, Paul is saying, you know what? No one was like you. And we were saying that the church in Corinthians was so stingy. And remember, they were giving out of nothing. They were extremely poor. Yet they were still giving. Go to Romans chapter 12, please. Romans chapter 12, verse 10 to 13. It says, Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor, not lagging behind in diligence. Fervent in spirit, serving in the Lord. Rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, devoted to prayer, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality. Contributing to the needs of the saints. Paul never forgot. The church in Philippi never forgot that. Practicing hospitality. You know the meaning of hospitality? It means allowing a stranger to live in your house. That's hospitable. Allowing a stranger. There's a saying, out of sight, out of mind. If you don't see anybody for quite some time, you forget about them. You know, Bambino is notorious about that. If he doesn't see a friend like friends of our friends, the kids, and they would say, hi Bambi, and Bambino would say, do I know you? And I keep on saying, anak ko lang ganyan. he tends to forget out of sight,